Welcome back. Today, I'd like to analyze another game that I won recently on chess.com. I had won several daily games in a row and I had hoped to put all those in one video, but it takes me too long to analyze, so it looks like I'm just getting one per video. Also, I had hoped to continue with my Chess Everyday program, the little logo that you might see on my thumbnails, but recently it's been more like chess on some days and not on other days because of, things going on outside these videos. Anyway, here is another game that I won. I had just run the game review and it says I played with 91% accuracy here. I had no mistakes, blunders, misses, inaccuracies even. And down here it says I played like a 1950 rated player, which is unusual for me. And not only did it take several days, probably a couple of weeks to play this game, but the end of it was more than a week ago now. So I don't remember much about it. Let's see if we can learn anything. Maybe we can switch it to my opponent's perspective and see what they could have played that was better. It looks like I checkmated on move 20. So you know what? Let's do that. I don't know. I may have done that at some point in the past, but my opponent opened with e4 and I responded to that with the French defense as I normally do. We played a relatively normal French defense with book moves here. I've been taught to play this since I've been learning the French defense. I've had mixed results depending on what my opponents do. I see knight to f3 quite often, which helps defend that pawn. I get my knight out. These are all book moves. Now here what my opponents normally do is play c3 because I've got two attackers on this pawn and they have two defenders on this pawn, and I'm probably going to find another way to attack it, either with the queen going through there, or sometimes I get this knight out this way, which attacks that pawn. So normally, like I said, I have opponents play c3 or bishop to e3 to defend that pawn. The engine would play c3 or bishop to d3. I think I've had opponents play that too. But I've also had quite a few opponents play bishop to b5. And I, until just now, didn't realize that was an inaccuracy every time that they do that. Now, because I was going to play queen to b6 anyway to put more pressure on their d-pawn, it made sense to do it now, and Stockfish would just bring that bishop back. But my opponent took the knight, which isn't listed here, but I don't know how bad it was. It's not listed as a mistake or inaccuracy either, and it's slightly better for me to take back with the pawn. Okay. I can understand why my opponent went ahead and took the knight. Normally, if you go out and pin a piece and that piece, that you've pinned with is immediately threatened, it's basically calling your bluff, saying, were you really going to stay here and pin this piece, or are you going to back away now? I suppose they could have defended it, either with this pawn, or maybe even getting a knight out. They could have defended the bishop instead of taking, but I can understand why they did. If you're going to go through the trouble of trying to pin a piece and you're immediately called on it, a lot of times it is the best move to take, and that's probably what they thought. And here again, now that they've gotten rid of that bishop, I expected the c3, which is what Stockfish would play, or castling. And I think I've mentioned I've had opponents play bishop to e3 here to help defend that d-pawn, but my opponent got this knight out, which I thought that move wasn't great. Not only does it block the c-pawn, which, can't move forward anymore, but I thought I could just take here. Now, I have less attackers on that square than they do, but I also have another c-pawn. So I thought if I took here, they'd probably take back with the knight, and then I'm just going to push this other c-pawn, and I'm doing fine. And they no longer have this bishop that can come out here to check. It looks like that's one of my two best moves, and it is my opponent's best move to take. And is my best move to push the c-pawn? No, it still wants me to play bishop to a6. It said that last turn too, I think, which I suppose that's to keep them from castling. But it just says that they would put this knight back here on e2, and then why did I put my bishop on a6? Stockfish does that sometimes. It says to go ahead and put this here, which the only purpose I can ever figure out for that move is to keep them from castling. But then they can just block that. Oh, it actually says they would block with the other knight. Oh, okay. And I guess it doesn't matter, but then they can castle after that a couple of moves later. So I don't know why I would threaten that if they can so easily undo my thread. Anyway, c5 is one of my two best moves. And here my opponent played their best move. They put the knight back. And I just have a very slight advantage playing with the black pieces. Again, I'm supposed to play bishop to a6 here. I'm probably not going to find that because, again, it's so easily, blocked. And it says if they did that with the knight, then I would put my queen up here on b5, which isn't really aiming at that because that square's defended twice. And then they would play a4, immediately attacking my queen. And then I would slide up one to c4, and then they would put the knight back over there. That's what it says. I don't know why we would play that little dance. I really don't. Play this, and then they would attack my queen, and then I would slide my queen in here, and then they would put their knight back. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I wanted to get some of these pieces out so that I could castle. Knight to e7 was not counted as a mistake. Now my opponent should definitely castle since I didn't put my bishop over here. But they saw something, or thought they saw something. They played knight to g5. I don't blame them. Lots of times in my games when I didn't know what to do and I just made a lame move like castling, Stockfish during the analysis later says, oh, you should have played knight to g5. And I don't know why. And a couple of times I've played it just on a whim thinking, maybe this is one of those times, and maybe that's what my opponent did here, but I can't see what they're looking at with knight to g5. There's no threat that I can see, but my opponent saw something here. I think if I was my opponent at this stage, I would have tried to get the other bishop out or castled, and it does not say the bishop. It says either knight to e2 or castling. I think that's what I would have played, but they played out here, which incidentally undefends this pawn, which I was about to attack. That's the whole reason I got my knight out this way. Well, the other reason is because I couldn't put it where I normally would on f6, but in this French defense, when this e-pawn ends up undefended, you get the knight out this way so that you can attack the e-pawn. And they undefended it, so I just went about my business. It's not my best move. Stockfish says go ahead and play h6 so their knight will go back, but I just got my knight out so I could go after this pawn. Now here, they must have realized that they had undefended this pawn and they brought the knight back. So that makes sense to me. I understand why my opponent would have played that. What I don't understand is why they put the knight forward in the first place. But now they're not supposed to bring it back and defend that pawn. They're supposed to castle. And it says if they castle, then I wouldn't take that pawn. I would just play bishop to e7. I'm pretty sure if they castled here, if they had castled, I would have taken the pawn. But they dropped back to defend it, which the engine doesn't like, but it made sense to me. And now I played bishop to a6. Now it's not my best move. Now I should play d4 just to continue pressuring with these pawns. But I did want to, get these bishops off the back rank. And of course, I'm not going to take this pawn now that they've defended it. I know one move I considered here was queen to c7 because that would give me an extra attacker on that pawn. I thought maybe the problem was that after I took, then they could put the bishop here, pinning my knight to the queen. Maybe that's not a problem because I could have brought my bishop out to defend the knight. I'm not sure. No, because if I put my queen back, they would still have another turn. Oh, and they probably would have. Oh, okay. I remember now. And it's weird seeing it from the other side. I'm pretty sure I did consider this, but I thought they could immediately put this knight here on b5, threatening my queen. And then why did I put it there? So that's why I played bishop to a6 here. It wasn't to keep them from castling. It was to keep their knight from going to b5. And they're supposed to play a4 immediately. I'm not sure why. I don't know what would lead my opponent to find that move. I would assume that it has something to do with still wanting to put the knight on b5 and defending it that way. That can't be right, because I would just take it, and then when they took with the pawn, I would take the pawn too, and I would be up a pawn. Or just put this knight back here, but again, I didn't put the knight there to keep them from castling because I knew they could play that. I put the knight here to keep them from playing that when I played queen to c7. Well, they played a3 for reasons unknown, and even though it's not listed among my best moves, I played queen to c7 because that was my plan the whole time for putting this here so they couldn't attack my queen. Now I have two attackers aimed at their e-pawn. My opponent is still supposed to play a4 or h4. Well, I don't fault them for not finding those. I probably would have tried to defend this pawn here, or maybe defend the pawn with the queen, something like that. No, not the queen. Hopefully I wouldn't play that. But it's clear that I'm going after this pawn. That was my whole plan over here. I've moved my queen here. I've got this knight out a strange direction, and it's all because of their e-pawn, which is, it's pointed into my territory, and I don't really like that. But they just brought that knight back, which was their best move on the previous turn, and it does, allow them to castle, but it undefends this pawn. It is my best move to take the pawn, and they're supposed to go ahead and take the knight, and I'm going to take back, and then they're going to play c3. I thought they were going to take, and I was going to take back, and I was prepared to, to try to get away with my queen somehow, but they just put this knight over here. Now here, I don't think it takes a genius to find my best move. Part of the whole plan over here had been to develop these pieces and castle. I put the bishop there to protect that knight so that my queen wouldn't end up pinned behind it somehow, and it was my best move. Now c3 was something they were supposed to play in a different line, and they played it now, but instead, Stockfish wanted them to put the knight up here, or take that knight again. What does knight to h5 do? It says I would castle, and then they would take that. Yeah, they're supposed to take the knight or go knight to h5, and I don't know what knight to h5 does. That's another one of those, like all the times I previously mentioned, where Stockfish says to go to g5, and this time my opponent did go to g5, and it wasn't right. So, all that really does is ensure that I castle, right, because it's aimed at that pawn, but I'm clearly trying to castle, so that would just force me to do what I wanted to anyway. But that's their best move. That's not their best move, even though it was a good move in another line. I don't know why it was a good move in the other line. Maybe they're aiming for this b4 push. I'm not sure. Now here I'm surprised that the move that I played was counted as the best move by Stockfish. In fact, by quite a bit. That's a whole point and a half of advantage. I just saw that I could check them because that square is protected by my bishop, and then they would be forced to move their king, which meant that they can't castle. I wasn't really interested in preventing them from castling, and a lot of times it turns out to not have as much of an effect as Stockfish thinks it would have, but sometimes it does, especially in this case where they have cleared out those squares, and it looks like they did intend to castle at some point. Once I check them here, they have to move the king, and then they can't castle. And I'm a pawn ahead, so I thought there's probably something I could do with that afterwards. I don't know, maybe go back out here. It also depended on where they moved their king. The engine thinks that they would go to king to d2, but I thought, what if they went to one of those other spots? That's kind of what I was hoping for. I thought if I went here and they, I don't know, got out of check by going to one of the two light squares where my bishop could check them, then I could go over here and get their queen for the knight. But that is by far my best move, and my opponent played king to d2, which is their best move. Not that far behind it is just taking the knight. I had no idea that was -5 here. I was guessing it at maybe -1 or -2 at the most. The -1 is for the pawn. I'm up that extra pawn that they weren't able to defend correctly earlier, and because of forcing their king to move somehow, I thought that might give me an extra point. So I'm not sure where the -5 comes from. But yeah, my opponent found the best move. They probably saw that the bishop could hit those squares. The problem now is that I can check them again, and that's because this bishop, I developed it when I was supposed to. I didn't see that ahead of time. Again, I was kind of hoping that the king would go to the wrong place earlier, or just move, and then that would be enough. But once they did that, I realized I could check again, and they can't block that check, so they're going to have to move again. And they're probably not going to want to move to those same two light squares again. They're probably going to want to go the other way, and then I would be able to fork their queen and rook here. So when I checked them here, king to c2 is their best move, so when they moved there, it's not my best move to fork them. It's my best move to play rook to b8. Well, I'm probably not going to find that, or just take this bishop. Normally, you don't want to trade a developed piece for one that hasn't moved yet, so I'm surprised that that's one of my two best moves. Because my bishop's moved twice already, and they haven't made an effort to move that one. And my bishop's also in a fairly strong square. I guess the problem is once I take their pawn, they can take my bishop, and they're threatening my queen. But then I could take their bishop, and I'm still forking them. I'm not sure. But if I take now, they're probably going to take with the rook, and then I would play rook to b8. Well, I can say with certainty that rook to b8 was not on my radar here. I was just looking at this fork, and I thought my bishop's protected. If they take it, I'll be okay. So I did the fork as I said. Their best move is to take my bishop, and they did. But as I said, I thought I could just take it back, and I still have the fork going on down here. And now I'm 2 pawns ahead because I just took the f2 pawn. I think here my opponent failed to recognize how many different ways I could check them and how many squares in their territory that I control. I'm still not sure what rook to b8 was about, but I do know that my light squared bishop is cutting off important squares on their side of the board, that my queen is cutting off important squares on their side of the board, and my knight, is hitting various squares on their side of the board. And also I have various ways to slide around and check them, places that are protected. What they had to play here was queen to d2, which I would take, and they would take back, and then I would take the rook for the knight. They could have also played rook to c1, but that would have been much worse, and I'm not sure what rook to c1 would have accomplished. But I know what queen to d2 would have accomplished, and that's a direct threat on my queen as well as the knight, so if they don't take here, they can blunt the attack, is basically the idea of that. I wasn't sure about that either. I thought they were just going to do the normal thing, like move the queen out of the way, and then I would get the rook. But they moved the queen way over here. And yes, I almost took the rook. I don't know how bad of a mistake or blunder that would have been. I wasn't sure that I had a mating sequence here, but I do know that before I take the rook, my knight is still defending d3, and I can check on d3. And my queen's cutting off these squares, and my knight's hitting that one. And of course, my bishop on d3 would be cutting off 2 other squares, so that would only leave them 1 legal move. And then once they went there, it looked a lot like I could check them over here. I wasn't entirely sure because I have trouble visualizing where pieces are going to be after I move them. I'm still working on that, but I thought it's either mate or something's about to happen. Like, for example, the rook can still go to b8. Now I started thinking about that if the king went out that way. It does turn out to be mate in 2. When I checked them there, that was my great move, it said. And of course, they only have the 1 legal move. And this is checkmate, which I saw now that the pieces are in this position. I didn't see when the king was still down here and my bishop was still over there. No, I saw it. Rook to b8 would still result in a mate in 3, but I think if I played rook to b8, they could go down king to a2, and then I would still have to play queen to c4, and they would have to block with that pawn, which I would just take, and that would be checkmate in 3. But I saw this and it's checkmate. I was pretty happy with that. Since I flipped it to my opponent's perspective and I tried to see it a little bit through their eyes, I'm not worried about their inaccuracies, but I think on each one of their mistakes, I definitely would have played something differently, probably not the best move. Here I would not have played knight to g5 because I don't know what it does, and I know that that's the French defense. I know that this person's coming after the pawn, so I would have left this knight here and probably castled, and that turns out to be the best move. On their other mistake, I definitely wouldn't have played that because I don't know why they would have even considered putting the queen all the way in the corner. Obviously, wherever you put the queen on this back rank, it's going to be protecting that rook. It doesn't make sense to go all the way to the corner with it. And you can take the queen off the back rank because the rook's going to be defending the other rook too. All you need to do is get this off the back rank. And I'm so prone to queen trades, I think I probably would have moved up to trade the queens here. But I wouldn't have realized that I was down -4, almost -5. Or I might have just moved over 1, but it says queen to d2 is their best move, but rook to e1 is their second best move. And of course, if they did that, I would take their queen. But what's wrong with queen to e1? Does that, oh, that still sets up the same mate. Wow. Okay. So my opponent was pretty cooked right here. Just neither one of us realized it yet. They just thought they were about to go down, this exchange here, and they were already down a couple of pawns. I got their e pawn, I got their f pawn, and now I'm about to get the rook for the knight. Neither one of us realizing that mate is right around the corner unless they play here. Which, like I said, it's probably what I would have played, especially it's a daily game. I would have had plenty of time to think about it. And here, if I'm playing with the black pieces, which I was, and if they had played that, I'm pretty sure I would have traded, which would have been my best move. Well, I feel pretty good about that, especially finding this check, and then after they moved there, realizing that that was going to be checkmate. So checkmate in 20 moves in a daily game is pretty rare. I actually don't know how rare it is overall, but I know for me to get one, it's pretty rare. I've had it happen to me a couple times, which is pretty embarrassing, and I try not to have it happen as often as possible. Anyway, I hope you got something out of that. I know I wasn't able to go too deep into it, and that's because I'm not a chess expert, but also I haven't been doing a lot of chess analysis or puzzles or anything for a few days because of stuff going on in real life. I need to do something like this every few days to keep my mind engaged with chess. And hopefully, maybe in my next video, I'll try to do some puzzles again. Thank you for spending your time here. Thank you for all the support. I'll see you next time.